Welcome back, ladies and gentlemen, to Deep Thoughts on this windy California day. I think it's about 70 degrees. It's good to see the sun out. As I punch this Herrera Steli Toro, my brand new punch. God, the thing is so nice. So today I thought I would cover a subject that I actually meant to cover last season, and it completely slipped my mind. I hadn't started my Wunderlist for the show, and that is something to the effect of, and I'm not sure exactly how I'll spin the title, but it's about nostalgia, the power of it, and whether or not there's any value in it, or we're sort of conditioned as we get older to feel stupid about having any nostalgia. But what is nostalgia? I mean, really, it's not as easy as the definitions that are thrown around. Done 400 goddamn shows, never had a fly touch me, it's like this dude's like, "Hey man, what's up? You fly around your head." Maybe I'm dead and I don't know it. Oh. But nostalgia, let's just break it down at least into two distinct areas. There's probably more, because it doesn't take long before you start building it up, right? The first phase of nostalgia is just having a memory of something past. And it could be a thing, it could be a person, it could be an institution, it could be an entire culture. Like, it used to be this way. I mean, you hear me lament about my own nostalgia on episode after episode, right? But then you have this sort of yearning, this sort of no country for old men theory of wanting to get back to your nostalgia, back to what you used to value, or what you value today that you used to have. And so it develops a weird interpretation of the current days, because we yearn for things that will never be the way they used to be. Even if we're able to recreate them to the best of our ability and everyone's on board, it just won't be exactly the way it was, because you intentionally recreated it as opposed to the serendipitous, accidental, organic method of which you first encountered it. In some cases, obviously, the world's an infinite place. You could have orchestrated it in the past, and you can orchestrate it again. But I just find that, I coined this thing with myself in a previous episode here, which is just trying to put all the chaos back in the box the society has dragged out. And you obviously know, and I obviously know, you can never do it. It's like all that packing you get from companies every once in a while. They'll pack some parts and some cords and cables, and you need to pack it back up because you're selling it to a buddy, and you just can't get the shit back in the box no matter what you do. And you're like, how the hell do these people do it? That's sort of today if you want to go backwards. I did my episode on needful things. The constant lusting of man for material objects or things that are nostalgic, that remind them of the past. And it's just a huge, powerful wake, because I think that the more that we do that, and the more that we're incapable of actually fulfilling that nostalgia, then we feel bad. We have like this failure algorithm inside of ourselves that we dislike the current day times. We can't roll with the punches. We really want to just teleport back to our childhood and live in it again. And of course, we always overlook everything that was sort of difficult when we were kids, because the brain simply won't hang on to anything that's negative. It just won't, if it has an alternative. Now, I've got friends that hang on to negative like you wouldn't believe, but I think for me, the algorithm that repeats itself in my own brain year to year has to do with the difficulty of just being alive. and that I can remember my parents living in a much simpler time. I'm going to have to go do scarecrow duty here. I'm sure it'll go off here in a couple more seconds. When I hear about the way my grandparents grew up, it was a little harder. They had the Depression. Their jobs were more physical labor. So you had like my grandfather on one side of the family is working a farm. The other dude is he owned a dry cleaners at one point. He was a city clerk at one point. One of my grandmothers was a full-time teacher. The other one was a stay-at-home mom. But whatever they committed to, it paid the bills. That was the nice thing. And their jobs lasted forever if they wanted to do it forever. Like my grandfather could have been a farmer on his own land for a long time. He ran oil wells on his land after that. My parents, they lived through that sort of just. Well, it was pretty funny. I did my scarecrow routine, and he went into alarm mode, and all these other crows showed up to back him up. It was pretty funny. All right, back to the subject here. These goddamn crows are fucking up my routine here. So when I look backwards, I can definitely see the society was much more reliable, much easier. Again, you got a job and you could keep it for the rest of your life and retire. In my little hometown, you would be an accountant, a chiropractor, a janitor, a teacher, whatever, a car salesman, and you simply could stay that your whole life. We had a guy that used to work the Texaco station just half a mile from my house. He's always the Texaco station guy. He didn't own the place, but you would pull in, you knew his name, he'd clean your windshield, take care of your car, fill you up, and you just love the guy. He's just that guy. And if he ever needed anything, because he has a long history of helping you out, you're there for him, no matter what he needs. And that's how it used to be. Now again, New York, LA, Chicago, Dallas, all these different big cities, I wasn't here when I was a kid, so I don't know. It sure seemed like it was a lot more reliable. Nostalgia spreads over every metric of human consciousness, right? It is how well things were made, how things were made. Maybe you liked a particular style of something better. We look at music today, and the kids today, I mean, you got the Z's coming up, ripping guitars apart and drums, and I think we're going to be doing really well in about 10 years, less than 10 years. But your millennials couldn't figure out music to save their soul, and X wasn't exactly that much better. The baby boomers dominated music. I mean, amazing accomplishments, right? So why bring this up? Is it just to lament about this interesting emotion? Some of it is. But what's sort of interesting about it is that here we are in the middle of a society that isn't worth continuing the way that we've been running the game. The whatever generation has fucked it completely up. Whatever generation is, responsible for, generations responsible for messing the entire world up, it's all been done. So now we can see it. It's not as bad as it could be. It could be worse. But it's pretty bad right now. Art is almost non-existent in this world, and it used to be that you could go down to Rodeo Drive, go into an art gallery, and see the finest art from Russia, from Europe, from America. And now you go in, and it's just rehashed old stuff. They're just trying to sell old things, or the new things are just a joke. And there are some artists out there that are just utterly phenomenal, but they're rare, super rare now. I used to bathe in this stuff when I first got here in '87. Who's this? Who's that? Who's this? And a lot of these people were unknown artists somewhere in the world that were just pounding out the most amazing things. So here's where nostalgia comes in, potentially as a tool to determine where we want to go from this point forward and how we want to do it, and sort of not just exactly what we want to tangibly have in our hands, but the sort of archetype of how we want society to work. Now, isn't it cool when you have, you're going to learn a new skill? You want to learn how to paint, like fine painting. And so if you just randomly go to class and they give you a bowl of fruit and a wine bottle and some cut cheese or a naked person, it's okay. You got to learn how to do that too. But if that doesn't interest you, then you're going to be screwed when it comes to really having a passion for something that you would have a passion for as long as it was different and something you were interested in. So you pick a photograph of a loved one, perhaps someone who's passed or someone who's alive, and you want to just honor them while they're, while you have a chance, and you paint it. Or you get a car photograph, some wild chrome, it's got some, beautiful reflections off of it, and you're like, I need to learn how to paint this. And so you just start. You're crappy at first. You paint little tiny paintings first, and then you get to the bigger ones as you get better. Every time I learn how to program a language, I always pick a project that's been on my list for years, and I start programming it, and it becomes a tool that people can use. So nostalgia could be something that we use as a tool to figure out, how do we change this planet? What is our goal? When we talk about replacing our money supply and the digital currencies, that I talk about deflating the overall amount of money such that someone could go out and eat dinner and go to a movie for 25 cents, two people. I know that sounds absurd, but it shouldn't. It's just math. It's just dividing the ridiculous $50 tab down to 25 cents. And the cool thing is, money laundering in a society that's been deflated in its currency is almost impossible. How could you drop a penny? It's a big deal. Someone steals a penny from you, it's a big deal. So you instantaneously catch money laundering. All these companies that want to charge you an extra, 9/11 tax, like, fuck you, dude. That shit's long goddamn gone. You don't get any extra tax because I had a traumatic situation that was imposed on me a long time ago. So we have to set standards to figure out when we're done with our revolution, when we're done evolving to the next kind of oasis where we can then work to maintain it, because that's just going to be just like a relationship. A good country is like a good relationship. You got to work on it every single day. And every day you wake up, sometimes you, as I was told by one of the most powerful couples I ever met, you choose to love the other person. You choose to love your country. You choose to love a system that perhaps isn't the best for absolutely everybody, but overall it's the best thing that, will serve a huge society of 350 million people or more, to quote an American number. We'll just go through a few of them to kind of shake your mind a little bit, to say, okay, think about the agendas of the world, which are obviously much more world peace, solving world hunger, all that good stuff. But let's just look at some fine-tuned things that make us excited to be alive. Of course, not warring is one of the most exciting things most exciting states that the world could ever be in. And there's no pending war. There's no building up tensions between two outfits. But look at the cars of the 40s, 50s, and 60s in the United States of America. Hell, even the 70s. Every decade's got their awesome cars, trust me. What happened in the 70s and 80s was awesome. In the 90s, not so much. There are some amazing brands out there that create amazing cars. But most of the brands have gone totally boring as shit. All the big four here in America, big three, plus some of the other stragglers, even the Tesla models are just boring looking. The SUV is the best thing that Tesla's ever done in terms of being sexy, but once you see the doors go up a few times, you're kind of done with it. But you look at a 58 Plymouth Fury, 57 Chevy, 65 Oldsmobile GTO, the Mach Mustangs, the old Firebirds, the dual intake early 70s Firebirds, the old Trans Am that Smokey and the Bandit used to drive. Those 59 or 49 Is it 49 Mercury? Yeah, 49 Mercuries. And the way that these people where I live customize these things and slam them and smooth them out and rebuild them, just honor them. Isn't it funny that these car retrofit shows where, the wife calls up those folks and says, hey, I got a car for you to redo. And they take the show and people share the expense, and then they take it off and fix it up. It's never like a, 95 Toyota Corolla. They don't want to fix that kind of shit up because it's boring. Look at the remake of the Malibu. What a joke. The remake of the Challenger. What a joke. These things used to be muscle cars, used to kick ass and take names. Now they're coming back, right? Most things are looking pretty cool nowadays, except the back window is so small. None of my friends want to own it. And yes, we were fuel inefficient and all this other stuff, but come on, we can fix all that. We can make these things electric cars if we want to, but at least they can be sexy. The other thing is I look at the clothing revolutions per decade, and it's phenomenal. Everything up to 1950 was pretty basic. Suits and dresses was good. People went to baseball games dressed up. I thought that was awesome. But then the 60s had this incredible explosion of longer hair and these wild kind of minimalistic dresses that these girls would wear. And then we came up with all the crazy dances, the twist and the potato and all those other things, right? The mashed potato. Then we got bell bottoms in the 70s, and we got sequences and all kinds of wild stuff. Look at Earth, Wind, and Fire back in the day. Parliament, Kiss. I mean, you had just... And society could dress sort of like, Led Zeppelin. It was sort of like you just get some polyester shirts, try not to gain too much weight. Society as a whole was actually much healthier. And we ate butter, and we ate eggs. We ate all these things that are supposedly bad for us because they were all organic. We didn't just OD on candy constantly. The 80s got silly with some of the bands, right? But everybody was happy and everybody was kind to each other. And then again, there's that dark era that we've been in ever since the globalists really started taking over American culture. Now we're bathing in all these satanic fucking bands. So it's hard to describe to a young person today the euphoria it was to wake up in these eras. It was exciting to go outside. It was exciting to go to a party. It was exciting to watch a movie because society wasn't so dark. We didn't have all this terrorist crap trying to keep everybody on edge. It's a beautiful monarch butterfly flew by. And the thing is we just had Vietnam. We had the Korean War. We had the nuclear scare. We had this Cold War thing. So if you wanted to focus off on all that negative stuff, I suppose you could. But it wasn't until we had like CNN headline news in the 80s that we could sit there and OD on propaganda and demise of this and that and why there has to be a war here and a war there. And, when some of you remember, or at least my age, when Desert Storm was being covered on television, we were drunk on missile cameras. Remember that one that was the general? I forgot that big guy's name. Looks like Captain on Gilligan's Island, but it came. They put a missile supposedly inside of a like an air conditioner drain, or like some vent on top of the hill. I don't mean to say drain, but like a pipe, and then it blows up in the center of the building. And it was like, man, we put a smart bomb right down this hole, and then poof, the whole building explodes. And we're like, yeah, more of that, man. Maybe there's a bunch of people in there, Yeah, I'm sure there's a bunch of dumb bad guys in there who have been riled up. The nest has been kicked around quite a bit. They're just trying to fight for their land. Yeah, we might disagree about damn near everything about how to live life and how to treat women and all that stuff, but they weren't headed for my doorstep at the time until we started pissing everybody off. I didn't grow up in the 30s and 40s, but I tell you what, man, when I go back and look at the music and the entertainment, the films that were made back in those days, you listen to that sort of 1940s war music, Mr. Sandman and company, what is it, the Bugle Boys of Company B. You hear those kind of songs, you hear Glenn Miller, you hear Sing Sing Sing. I didn't grow up in that era, but I tell you what, man, I have total nostalgic force to live in that era. You look at Jerry Lewis and Dean Martin before they got all angry at each other. It's an amazing era. The Rat Pack, amazing era. I wasn't even alive. Still amazing. But here's what I find sort of interesting, and it's sort of an overlay on society today. I often talk to you guys about resurrection after death, and the fact that when we do resurrect, we obviously are not keeping the majority of our memories from a previous life. And so we get to believe in magic again, Santa Claus, Easter Bunny, Tooth Fairy, all these things. School is sort of this wild symbolic thing, it's like when you're young and you're looking at a fictional book of a dinosaur that hangs out with a kid named Danny, or Freaky Friday, or all these other things, or shoes are sticking to the wall and stuff on that particular day. Somebody has 3 legs. It's real inside your mind. It's like, well, where do I find this world? That's what it was when I was a kid. And then I grew up and all the magic disappears. And then sort of the cynicism of living with individuals that are now struggling with life. And isn't that sort of what's going on in, I can't speak for other countries, but in America, and I would love to hear, okay, if you live in Europe or other places, Australia, anywhere else in the world, and you're hearing this nostalgia thing, please tell me the archetype of your country and sort of where you think it was great, if you still think it's great, and, where you think you're headed sort of thing. Because for me, you take the 20th century, which is the 1900s, and you go back to, we were kind of broke in this country around Charlie Chaplin's days, but again, you could do an honest day's work, and father went to go work, mom stayed at home, and you had all the amenities of life. And so I feel like that was sort of our infancy as a country. We got rid of this tumultuous 1800s where we were building a railroad and coming up with where towns were going to be, and we're living literally in log cabins where winters were brutal, summers were brutal, and you still had to work. You still had to plow a crop, you still had to do whatever the hell you had to do, cut down trees, hunt food every single day. So we got rid of that whole first formidable 10 decades, right? So for me, I feel like the 19th century for America was sort of our adolescence, our childhood. But we had a bunch of really stoic, staunch adults from pretty much, I'd say, back to 1776 all the way up to the 50s. They had this morality locked in with the church. As soon as you got older, you weren't supposed to show your emotions. In fact, that was one of the big dysfunctional things that Mr. Rogers tried to circumvent, was the children were becoming sort of mentally abused because the parents weren't awake. And in the 60s, we sort of started waking up, and then he took that baton and ran with it, right? But now, as I get older and the world gets more cynical, just around me, we're noticing all these cabals that destroy the society, bankers and monarchs and politicians that are sellouts, and military guys that are sellouts, intelligence officers that are sellouts, CEOs that are sellouts. It occurred to me the other day that if you guys haven't seen it, if you want to see a great example of corporate globalism and sellout, go look up the Nestle CEO talking about the fact that he doesn't think that human beings have the right to clean water. Wow, right? We now have political correctness off the chain, so no one can even communicate without some scumbag sitting on the side going, you said that word in the wrong tense, and you can't say that anymore. Here's what's the new word. Well, we're still trying to figure out the new word, but it's got a 5-year, sentence on it. So in 6 years, that word will be bad word. I feel like once we hit the 90s, it's sort of wherever a normal human being hits their level of, oh God, life is getting hard. I got 3 kids. They all got to go to college. I only got money for one to go to college. And what do I do? I don't want to screw my kids, down the line. The best thing about the 21st century is the internet and this great awakening, and everyone kind of going, yeah, you know what? My grandfather used to tell me these guys were bad. And then my dad started telling me these people were bad. Now I'm finding out that they're bad. And now we're finding out that even while we were celebrating previous eras of our country was being taken over. What I find a little confusing, especially for the 2 or 3 listeners that always report in from the UK and some of you that report in from Australia, we have, in my opinion, the European bloodline has been there for an extremely long time. At least 2,000 years that are pretty well documented. So for me, you don't get tyranny, you don't get monarchies, you don't get globalism and socialism and fascism easily if everybody has already been through it once, and it's ceremoniously failed, unanimously failed every single time it comes about. The second your country takes away your guns, here comes all this draconian law that takes away all of your rights. It just happens. It's just a 1-2 punch that they do. And I'm not sure if it's just the Prussian education system where people are so nationalistic in a bad way that they're willing to just do anything that their leaders say. I can't understand it. I don't know how Europe appears in my eyes to be beat down to the point where they just look the other way as all this chaos and craziness happens. And what's nuts is, I started this show 2015. We started the previous show in 2014, early like March 2014, and none of this weird transformation of Europe had started. And then we watched it occur during, I think, this show. And it's just mind-blowing. In America, one of the things that Europeans say when they come over here is, man, every building you have is brand new. Your highways are brand new. Everything's brand new. And if we leave for 10 years and come back, half the buildings that we saw last time we were here have been torn down and rebuilt. It's just what you guys do. And they're right. So for me, when I go to Europe, when I was in England several times, I'm looking at buildings and I remember asking these people, well, how old are those buildings right there? And one person estimated one row was like 400 years old and one row was like 800 years old. And I'm going, 800 years old? What are you talking about? I said, that 1200 BC AD? What are you talking about? Well, yeah, I think they came in, this time. And they may have been wrong, but I think the 400-year one was definitely true because it just looked ancient. But people were still renting the place and living in it. It's been totally retrofitted, totally cool. So maybe only a partial amount of its veneers, the only thing that's left. The inside's been completely rebuilt, but they did an amazing job at these places I was observing. So it dawned on me that wow, yeah, obviously Germany, where I was born, my family lived for a while. I have whole albums of that stuff as a kid, and that stuff's ancient stuff, right? So for me, the ability to maintain a contact with nostalgia in Europe and in England and Scotland and Ireland should be really easy because it's right there. Like I went to the high school that my parents went to, all my aunts and uncles went to, and my grandmother went to. It was built in like 1924. And so it had one retrofit on it for a 4th floor, I think, an extension on one side or whatever. They finally just tore it down. Because that's what we do, right? We tore it down. We just retrofitted the entire building to be absolutely perfect inside. I remember visiting it and walking around the building and going, oh my God, this is like really modern inside. But it was like a three-story brick building with like a 4th story that was condemned, which is kind of weird. But they had to tear it down and build a single story. It's a beautiful new high school. And so change is usually really difficult to get a society to go through because of nostalgia. And then you have the fear of change, because change is where we make mistakes. And not everybody in a society wants to go for that big risk of, well, I kind of like the way England's run right now. You can call us whatever name you want to call us. And that's typically how it works, is that the globalists hatch all these new phrases on top of, you're a xenophobe, you're a racist or whatever. And everyone's like, oh, that's not us. So, well, okay, everybody can move here now. It's like, it's insane. What's funny is, or interesting, I guess I should say, is that America has 350 million people, roughly. But when we go to Europe and hear about the entire population of countries, it's like 60 million here, 30 million there. We got countries in Europe that have less people or the same number of people as LA plus all of its surrounding counties. There's many countries that are smaller than Tokyo. It's got 40 million people. And maybe that low number allows the indoctrination and the manipulation of Europe to be far easier. Whereas in America, we've got an electoral system and we just don't vote into it, For me, it's a beautiful vector for the mind to track to, is to go back and say, well, you go up to a millennial today and say, hey kid, how do you like the world that's right now? Do you think it's great? Do you think your tax rate's great? Do you think your retirement capabilities are great? Do you think your employment opportunities are great? How easy do you think it's going to be to get married and have kids and put them all through school? What if you want your wife to stay home and she wants to stay home and raise the kids because you value this connection with your children? You don't want to surrender them to the state just as soon as they can walk. What if that kid said, yeah, I think it sucks. I think it's really hard. My kid lectures me all the time. It's not as easy, Dad, as it was when you were a kid. And I'm like, believe me, I know. And then as a parent, trying to be a guardian to your child, and, I know that just fixing my kid's life is not going to fix my kid's life. I have to fix all the kids' lives. I have to fix society, because my kid lives in the platform of reality that we have created. And so we're responsible. We're responsible for each other. If we have one soul, we should really knock it out of the park, shouldn't we? I read an article today. It was on a website that I think probably has more right than wrong, but it's kind of a heavy conspiracy website. But it was about a intelligence agent that confessed that day in September 2001 was an inside job, that they really blew these buildings up, that everything you were told about what happened was wrong. He revealed the fact that one of the planned impacts never happened. And he said that the project was called a project for a new century. That's what they call the code project, right? And there's some neocons that have borrowed that for a long time. And the whole thing could be fake, but he did a sworn affidavit that he was telling the truth. And we have another gentleman who was involved with the third building that fell in New York, and he confessed to being a part of that team to actually get the demolition and explosives in. Okay, so there was this heavy move to destroy the world in the first year of the 21st century, which is 2001. That's the way I see it anyway. You got to top off the last one. You get 2000 goes to the other one. 20th century has the 20 year in that century, the way I see it. And so that put, dystopian, weird 1984 body cavity searches in airports. It rationalized every single security checkpoint you could possibly conceive. And what's interesting is, I forgot to mention, and watch it turn on now that I've said this, but I haven't seen the drunk driving checkpoints in Huntington Beach for at least a year or so. Because between my house and the smoke lounge, there's a place where they love to do it. And what's funny is, if you happen to turn off the road before the checkpoint, they have like bike cops that'll chase you down like you're trying to evade it, like you're a fucking criminal. And you're like, no, I live this way. I don't use this main street because it's real busy and there's a bunch of drunks on it. Good luck. You should hang out at the bars. I use this back road, which every local resident uses. I just think that, the old adage, no country for old men, that's been around for hundreds and hundreds, if not thousands of years. That whole sentiment of older men going, well, society sucks now, I'm older, and it's not as good as it was when I was a kid. All right. But wouldn't it be interesting if we had a court case where you had to prove it? You know what? I could personally prove that 1989 to 1969 was way easier of a lifestyle than 1990 and up. I could show the societal, cultural art that was coming out degrading society. You could prove it. We didn't have women, called bitches and hoes and all that shit in the 80s and 70s. Was there a guy that did it? Oh, sure. But in terms of music that came out on the radio that said, this is the way you should treat somebody, the 2 Live crew blew that whole thing up. It was amazing. And you just take a small group of guys. And what's funny is most of these guys, pardon the specificity here, but you have a bunch of guys that weren't getting laid. But they make raps like they're getting laid a bunch. And then they get laid a bunch because they get famous talking out of their ass, right? But gun violence, the gang violence, the drive-by shootings, all that was in the 90s. Today, music's a little more upbeat. A little bit more upbeat. But there's still no sign of, dedication to excellence. We've had movements in the past where groups came out, the Black Panthers and that kind of stuff, because they were tired of what they were dealing with. And so they met, they were living in a more violent world, I guess, in the sort of the bad urban districts of the various major cities. So they rose up to fight back, brought violence to violence. Of course, their violence is bad, and the cops' violence at the time was good. But you just turn on the television, look at these old, goofy television shows we used to have. They wouldn't have been popular being good to everybody in the show if everybody was hating on each other. Because people would have watched the shows and went, man, life is not like this at all. And I'm sure there's, again, isolated districts that definitely had that emotion. If you were living in the bombed out Bronx of New York trying to watch Leave It to Beaver or the Brady Bunch, you're probably going, geez, look at these crackers, and their fantasy world they live in. But now let me throw this at you. The more awake you become, the more you have to go through that whole stage of accepting all of this crazy stuff that's been going on, and the more you study conspiracies as a whole, you find out that conspiracies have been the number one method by which these bankers have manipulated the entire world forever. Ever since they came into power, it's all been a conspiracy constantly. And what's funny is you hear about conspiracies all the time in the mainstream history / press, but then if you get to the ones that are darker, that's when you get the guy walking around the room going, oh man, you believe the whole world's a conspiracy. It's like, what are you watching on History Channel? Because all I'm seeing is a ton of conspiracy. You just have had those in your life your entire life, and they're all okay and cool. And the ones I'm talking about, or I'm clarifying an old one, like Lee Harvey Oswald shooting Kennedy would have been a conspiracy no matter how you worked it out. It's, it's usually 2 or more people conspiring against 1 or more people. King Tut was murdered, at his 18 years old. Someone hit him in the head and broke his skull open. Maybe he fell off a cliff. Maybe he was assassinated. All the Caesars killing each other. All the leaders in Europe killing each other. Franz Ferdinand being murdered. That's a conspiracy. A bunch of people threw grenades at the guy, and one guy finally popped him in the head. Someone tried to kill Andrew Jackson. Someone did kill John Wilkes Booth, zapped Lincoln. Martin Luther King was murdered. JFK was murdered. RFK was murdered. Malcolm X was murdered. These things really occurred. And of course, they love the lone gunman theory because that absolves anyone's need to look for a true group of people that benefited from these people's deaths. Vietnam was started on the two fake events called the Gulf of Tonkin. Pearl Harbor was a complete inside job, and now normal historians know it. The Korean War was really a police action. To all those guys that got maimed in Korea, that it was just a police action. It was a full-on war. The crash in 1929, total conspiracy of the banks to create a crash, to steal all the money. Stealing all of our gold by 1934. Roosevelt sold everybody out. Conspiracy. It's all over the place, and it's in mainstream world. But now when we start talking about the pedophiles and these child traffickers and human traffickers and all this money laundering and instigated wars to create, just like in 1984, the war that's never supposed to end because the enemy is this sort of apparition. It's not a country, it's a movement, It's a conspiracy. All these fake Syrians moving into Europe. Was that not a conspiracy? So nostalgia for me is sort of a gyroscope, a centrifuge of lucidity. It's a beacon of order where society got things right once. And maybe they hung on to it for a year, maybe they hung on to it for a decade, multiple decades. I happen to think America, for the most part, had good people that understood what was at stake if they lost, because they just finished the Revolutionary War, the War of 1812. We had, again, assassination attempts on the presidents and then assassinations of presidents. It used to be this thing where every 20 years the president was assassinated, right? Now, it's not true in America. But I want you to see nostalgia as a method for your mind to set a standard. You're setting a standard inside yourself to say life was this good. Now, if you have nostalgia way back to your childhood, that's a little bit harder to recreate, but I think the goal would be to say, of the children that exist today, are they having that quality experience you had when you were a kid? They weren't told about, milk cartons weren't covered with missing children, which is a horrific thing to do to children in the first place. By the time I had, I lived through, 5 years of the Vietnam War. I remember watching that stuff on TV. As a kid, I didn't understand the draft. I didn't know what that was. My father had been in and out of the military already, and so, he went in during Vietnam, but he came out before my memory started working. And so by the time I started really becoming sentient at 6 or 7 years old, it was over. Life was better. Everybody was tired of hating, of being in a place they shouldn't have been, risking life they shouldn't have risked, etc., right? I think one of the things we could do as adults that's very simple, very easy to understand, is that we had a method of living in the past, which a storyteller might say an archetype, right? It's the facets of a story that always occur. And so let's say we look back and we find these eras that we really liked. But instead of just yearning for that time machine to go back into that past, which we'll never be able to do, because time is a complete illusion, right? We could write down and itemize what those worlds were like, and then dedicate ourselves to say, okay, if anybody introduces anything that's against these methods of managing society, of educating children, of providing jobs, of monetizing money, and how do you monetize your money? How do you manage debt? All those things roll back. I mean, it's hard to tell kids today that credit cards are a very new thing. Now, credit and loans from banks aren't new, but my father was one of the first generations to ever get a credit card. I remember when ATM cards were brand new and ATM machines were brand new. I know that in my dad's generation, a gigantic portion of the males who got credit cards really thought of credit as free money. They never really contemplated having to pay it back, and so a lot of these guys went bankrupt. And then bankruptcy was like, this big thing, and divorce followed all these credit cards. And the reason why credit cards get out of control is because of what? Compound interest. It's the algorithm of usury that has raped cultures for thousands of years. But we still allow it to exist, and we actually believe that it's something that needs to occur. That it's somebody's right to do that. It's like, Now, did we have to mature as a society? Sure. I'll give an example where America desperately needed to mature, and because of some brave souls and a very famous black Republican named Martin Luther King, we got through this. But we had segregation. We had racism in this country. It took a really long time. You know, the Democratic Party was creating the KKK and the Jim Crow thing, and you had Senator Byrd being a Ku Klux Klan guy who Hillary Clinton worships to this day. They were keeping everything divided. The Republican North Yankees wanted slaves to be free and treated like human beings, and your Democratic South wanted to keep it separated. And again, all these Antifa people that tore down statues in the South, they're tearing down Democratic leaders. It's just the funniest thing. They think they're pounding on a Republican's head. It's like, nope, that's your party. And you have this lie that your party switched at some point. I think that's the funniest one. So we had to get out of this. And luckily in the 60s, before I was born, this oppression left. And luckily I was raised in a state that didn't really have, as far as I know, that we didn't have 2 fountains on buildings. We didn't force blacks to go in the back door. It was just, oh, come on in. We're part of the Yankee team. So, we take what's good about the past or good about what we're being nostalgic about, and we leave everything else behind. But the most intangible nostalgia that's tough to process is the fact that the human mind has evolved and devolved at the same exact time. It is sort of a feeling of mine that the modern day perception of society is there's this globalist effort telling you it's never been good. You got these Democrats out there saying, well, make America great. Well, when was it ever great? Oh yeah, there's your boat. Why don't you just go some fucking other place where it's so goddamn awesome, right? Again, my friends who travel the world and live in other countries for years can't wait to get home. And they can't wait to get home because they're no longer worried about disappearing where they live, being harassed by cops to the point where they may not come home and no one's there to help them. But the human mind today, in my estimation, is extremely scatterbrained because an average youth is being attacked from every single angle as soon as you turn 18. If your parents kick you out because you're not going to college, or you manage to scrape in your bedroom as a child until you're 22, then you get kicked out into society, and then you're trying to make ends meet in an aggressive economy. With globalism now, a lot of jobs that were always just thought to be jobs that you did in America because you live in America, where they've all been exported through NAFTA. Europe suffers the same problems, right? Europe has already commandeered every piece of land that could be commandeered in their countries because they've been there forever. I mean, I know you folks living there laughing at me, talking about you in third person, but in America we have a ton of land that we haven't really explored in terms of resources and living. So we got a lot of room. One of the sad things about the rite of passage, and I did an episode on this a long time ago, I think it was in season 2, is that there's this rebellious stage that is now indoctrinated into the youth. It happens biologically, but to what extreme is now been largely owned, because the globalists understand one thing about kids. If they don't understand anything else, they understand this one. As long as you can get the kid away from the parents, then you own their indoctrination. So that when they get through get to their biological natural state of rejecting their parents because they want to own their own life, they want to make their own decisions, they're making decisions that the globalists have thrown into their brain. Where do you get these Antifa kids from? A super fascist bunch of kids who say they're against fascism. I mean, hilarious, man. Unbelievable how absolutely ignorant these kids are. They're being had by the system, and they don't even know it. Now, luckily, a lot of that's calmed down a little bit, but they still have factions here and there. Now they're getting violent. They're getting violent in the name of their own movement, their own fascism. It's unbelievable. People who aren't like them, boy. You don't dress in black and hide your face like a big pussy, then you're not one of them. I want to remind you, too, as long as your enemy is not identified, they could be from anywhere in the world. And you might think they're kids from your backyard, but they've been flown in from another country on a little weekend trip so they can do this little protest, and they're back on planes and they're out of here. So I've had members of the lounge that I go to smoke. And one guy said a brilliant statement. He goes, I think that there should be an executive order that says if you're participating in any protest, in America at least, you cannot cover your face, ever. And you do? Straight to jail. Straight to jail. You do 90 days in jail. Maybe it's an instant sentence and you go off to prison. Have some fun, kids. And we'll see how many of these people get demasked, handcuffed, and you find out they're not even American citizens. And then the cabal and the conspiracy actually blows up a little bit such that the American people can go, oh, I thought these were our kids. I think one of the pieces of nostalgia that is sort of lost in globalism, and it's part of their goal, is to knock down nationalism. Now, nationalism can get really bad if you can't really have nationalism with a dictator. I mean, that's where the two kind of annihilate each other. What is it? President Putin and President Xi, they have declared themselves presidents for life. All right, maybe there's a reason why China needs that. Maybe there's a reason why Russia needs that. But I can tell you America doesn't need that. As much as I may like or dislike a president, but let's say I'm infatuated with the president, I still think 2 terms is pretty good. Because we need to be able to do more than just have one guy or one girl be able to run the country well. We need thousands, and it should be such that the education in a particular country is so thorough and so truthful about true history and conspiracies and how the world has been turned upside down that every candidate sits up at a podium and not only is capable of saying how the world really exists, but as they provide solutions, these theoretical solutions that they would put forth as a candidate, they're drawing from a standard that we as a society have agreed to. But isn't it funny how I say that, and probably some of you chuckled a little bit. Like, yeah, wouldn't that be great? It's not what's happening, and, I think the thing that there are detrimental nostalgia angles. And one of those angles has to do with people being very, I want to say feudalistic, but their whole thing is that they just give up on society. That's the nostalgia that they're used to. Well, you can't change anything. It's going to be the way it is. Pretty soon we'll have to join them, and they just give up on everything. If they think the presidential election is going to be thrown by the Democratic Party, they just give up. But they'll want to complain as soon as the bad stuff starts coming into their life, high taxes, socialism, all this other crazy stuff. They'll be the first person to want to complain about it. They don't have any nuts to stand up against tyranny. So, as I think about this episode, it's really, nostalgia could be a beautiful beacon. And again, you just beacon the stuff that's good, you leave behind the stuff that's bad. So let's just say the 1940s in America still had 2 water fountains in a bunch of places in the South, and schools were still segregated. Certain races weren't treated, fairly. We obviously don't want to keep that. But if we now have fixed a part of that, then we take the stuff that's good, we mix everybody together and say, hey, we're all going to be doing this now, not just the white people, not just the black people, not just whatever. Everyone's going to do this, and it's going to be great. Here's what I think is interesting. For the especially my own daughter and the kids that I was around as a young man as they were growing up. It didn't take but a few sessions with these kids and telling them about some of the bad things that life can throw at you if you get irresponsible. Like, obviously, if you have a daughter, you're trying to keep her from sleeping around. You're trying to keep her from being pregnant before she's a woman, before she's married, before she's got an institution where she can have some physical help, financial help, spiritual help. And these kids, like almost one for one, got that in their head early, thought about it, and when they hit their rite of passage, they messed around with their authority figures and their sort of direction in life, but they didn't mess around with those things because you got it into their head early enough. It was just a part of them. But there's so many kids out there that, mothers don't teach their daughters about menstruation. They don't teach them about ovulation. They don't teach them how they get pregnant. They don't teach them how to have sex. And so again, I met a girl who had 2 kids and one on the way and didn't know what ovulation was. And she didn't want to be pregnant the 3rd time. And so I asked her, I said, well, do you know when you ovulate? What's that? Oh my God. Is it her fault? No, it's her mother's fault. Teach your kids the basics of life, would you? It's a nostalgic idea, I know. But this is where we have failed our next generation. I think one of the things you can tell a young person, hopefully before they're 13 years old, is to say, don't you want to live a better life? Don't you want to live in a life where you can trust people? We're not saying you go out and immediately trust people, because right now you're surrounded by a bunch of scumbags that'll steal from you and lie to you, and your leaders will promise you one thing, and the last thing you're ever going to get is the thing they promised you. As a matter of fact, if your president says you can keep your doctor, keep your plan, and you're going to have health care even if you have a pre-existing condition, those are all the things that are never going to happen for you. If they say it's an Affordable Health Care Act, it's going to be so expensive you can't afford it. One of the things I forgot to mention about the guy that came into the lounge that I made an episode about is that he was talking about healthcare, and of course he's got this crutch. He's like, well, don't you think everyone deserves healthcare? And we're like, yeah. And I remember when I was a kid in my 20s as a software engineer, here I am totally healthy. Why the hell do I need a ton of fucking healthcare, right? I bought emergency healthcare insurance. It was $99 a month, and it was to help me if I got in a car accident, lost a limb, something bad happened, and it kicks in. But I also had a $5 copay for $100 a month. I wasn't a part of an insurance group. I was a part of all the other kids out there that were doing the same exact thing, buying $100 health care for emergencies only. My friends in Texas, a husband, wife, and a child, all 3 extremely healthy, never had any issues, were paying nearly $1,500 a month after the first year of Obama's health care. Oh, big surprise. He let the insurance companies, the pharmaceutical companies, write the policy, and he just signed it. The guy was a complete, disgusting, anti-American shill, trying to sell us out to the globalists. Nostalgia, had it been a part of our fabric, had it been a part of what we say can and can't happen, would have prevented that from occurring. The second that stuff turned up to be super duper expensive, and let's not forget the multi-billion-dollar website they created that couldn't handle the first registration cycle. Okay, as a web engineer, let me tell you, I was a head architect of a $320 million gaming platform that could have handled 20 million consecutive players at the same exact time. Getting it to $1 billion in the 21st century by 2010, this is almost... I guess it's 10 years after I did the other thing. It's an insane level of money. They should have just grabbed that dude and thrown him into the fucking ocean, man. You have lied to us. You have stolen our money. We got a bunch of kids strung out on college loans for degrees that are unemployable, and you're wasting this kind of money? Was it the Mueller report's now risen to a $40 million line item, which doesn't sound like much for a country, but that's 400 college degrees paid for if they had $100,000 debt apiece. What's it, the billionaire dude that just went to the inaugural speech at an all-black male college? He just paid for everyone's degree. Hats off to that dude. Talk about nostalgia. Talk about a guy with standards. I mean, I don't know if he's cut the check yet, but if he does, he should have a statue made of him at that college. And everyone else that comes through, they're like, that's our bar. He set the bar. You're Bill Gates. You got billions and billions of dollars, and you want us to listen to your horse shit about fucking making volcanoes erupt to protect the sky from the sun. You totally support vaccinations that depopulate the world. You're bragging about chemtrails now, manipulating weather. Not impressed, dude. Get your bank account out and write $1 billion worth of checks to kids that are suffering in this world. And guess what? They may actually follow what you have to say. Because they never want to part with their cash, do they? Even though they have more money than they'll ever spend in their entire lifetime. Some of these people, showboat and give money to globalist organizations like the UN. As if they've done anything for you. Remember Kofi Annan's kid, man? Sex for food in Africa. It's horrific. Horrific. Women getting raped to have enough food so they can feed their families. Yeah, that's the UN for you. One of the nostalgic things we used to have was that our forefathers and people, all the way up to like Teddy Roosevelt, we only elected people that had been successful in their personal lives. If they were a real successful businessman, now we can put businesswomen in this game too. They do understand the human condition. If you've built a gigantic corporation by yourself, like a Steve Jobs did, or, again, Gates's build was a little bit different and full of conspiracy, but there's a lot of good people out there that potentially could look at the government and say, look, what's the biggest suffering moment for a particular country? And it's really the monetary system. I just watched a great... I guess you could call it a mini documentary where this guy dispelled 10 myths about the financial system in America and what our debt really is made out of and how much we're in debt and how long and what methods we would use to fix our economy. And it came down to number 10. After proving that the America is in debt probably at a comfortable estimate about $150 trillion, most of it through Ponzi scheme money that we talk about through the Federal Reserve. If America cut its budget 10% and held it for 10 years, then in 10 years we'd have a balanced budget, and if we held that for 100 years, then we would be able to service all this illegal debt that we have. Now, the best way is to cut off the fiat currency and just basically tell them that was a criminal endeavor. The way you created our money was a Ponzi scheme, which means it's an impossible algorithm to ever pay back. So all the debt owed to you, we're considering that zero. Do your best to come after us. Because we just gave our military the most money they've ever had in their existence, and they're going to get really formidable. And just try to do your War of 1812 this time around. Countries in Europe that have divorced themselves from fiat currency are doing great. Some countries are still in it, and they're making moves to get out of it. But as long as they're part of the EU, it's going to be imposed on them. Nostalgia is a great beacon, isn't it? It's previous bars, previous standards that were set for society. I think the world should be re-engineered to a point where a mother could stay home with their kids until they're old enough to go drive themselves to school, and then mom goes off and either takes the previous degree she had before she had her kids or the degree she's going to get after her kids. And she's going to enjoy it because raising kids is harder than going to college. And so she's going to have just a blessed experience, and she should have the freedom to do that. She should have the money to do that. And for the women that want to go into the workforce and never have any kids, they just immediately go into the workforce algorithm, which is also amazing. They never have any kids. Well, they're earning enough money to have kids. They're earning enough money to put a husband at home to raise the kids. Great. Who cares what sex stays home? As long as there's that bond for the kids. The kids get out of school and dad or mom's right there with the car before they can drive themselves, picks them up, takes them home, takes them to their baseball game or their ballerina class or whatever it is. Get some jazz hands going on. And maybe there's places in Europe that still do this, that can do this. When I got into software engineering in the Bay Area, our company was centered in England, and we had the 75-person annex in the United States. Over there, you got much less pay, but you got a company car, you left at 5 o'clock, you didn't have to work on weekends, and you had a life. These people had 2 vacations a year. The United States, same exact company, got paid more, but we had less money at the end of the day because our country was quantitatively easing, which meant, stealing all the money out of our savings accounts and inflating the cost of everything. So in a world like we live in today, it's best to spend all your money right away because your savings is just going to get bled to death, right? Again, one of the things in this little documentary that I think is worth mentioning in this episode is, let's just say you made $50,000 a year and your luxury car cost $30,000. So making $50K, you got a car you can get a loan for $30K. Then you put $10,000 in the bank account, but they quantitatively ease money, thus devaluing money. You're paid $100,000 now. The car that was 30 is now 60, so everything is actually out there, costs pretty much the same, but it's only relative to the value of money. But the 10 grand you have in your bank account, if you still have it, by the time it raises and inflates 2x, now that $10,000 only has $5,000 worth of buying power. And that's how they steal from us when they quantitatively ease. And if that's still a little confusing, just think about in the previous era, you're making 50 and the car's 30, you take your 10 grand and you put it down on the car, you only owe 20. Fast forward to a 2x inflation, the car costs 60, you take your 10, you put it on the $60,000 car, now you owe 50 on the car. 20 grand more than you did from the previous era, the nostalgic previous era. And the funny thing is I always look back, and because I was in video games forever, I wonder, the Atari 2600 came out in the late 70s, and then the ColecoVision, the Intellivision, and a few other, the Nintendo system. And I try to think back to my mind of like, okay, what were my friends doing when I was a kid? And then what were we doing after these game consoles came out? Because initially they were so expensive that not every family had one. Then it was like every family had one. Then arcades existed, that sort of thing. But we were sitting at home when I was a kid with our guitars, trying to learn how to play. Drums were a little hard to get a hold of because they made so much noise. Parents didn't want to have those in the house. So the kids that got the drum sets early dominated because not a lot of kids knew how to pound the kit, But I have to say, as I watched the 80s mature, we were celebrating bands that made their skill sets in the 70s before these game consoles came out. And the funny thing is, when I talk to my 80s rock buddies with all the platinum records, and I say, well, what was your life like when you were learning your instrument? How did you get in your first band and all this other stuff? It's all 70s, because they're about 10 years older than me. There's no talk of hanging out in arcades. There's no talk of playing on these gaming consoles. They were at home studying their instruments. Because why? It was a nostalgic era where that was the only game in town. Interesting, right? And again, when you go into an elevator, a department store, it's playing like elevator music or whatever. You go into these themed restaurants, even restaurants that are not themed, and they're playing music. Other than a few in LA that are very kitschy and cliche, or I should say clicky, it's all music from the 80s or further back. No one's playing that 90s shit. You want to eat supper and listen to fucking Nine Inch Nails? You want to listen to Pearl Jam and Nirvana and all that? I mean, there's some Nirvana songs that are pretty generic, but it's all depressing, and they don't want you to be depressed while you're eating your food. And then they can't go hip-hop and pop because that stuff's either too teeny bop or, again, still gangster-related mindsets. I mean, today, if you think about, you go to TMZ.com every once in a while and you look at sort of how the left wants to engineer the world, because that's what that website's all about. We just lost Nipsey Hussle, right? This guy was out trying to champion a cancer cure. He was really trying to reveal the cabal, so was Tupac back in the day. But these guys get shot now. All right, well, let's go back to the 70s and the 80s. What rockers were getting shot? What rappers were getting shot? Those rappers from the 80s are still alive. When they do these documentaries on Netflix to see how the hip-hop industry came about, they can go back and talk to all those guys. They're on television shows now. They make movies. They own studios. They own, Cool J and Ice Cube are now buying a big part of ESPN or something like that. They're totally successful because they didn't live in that negative era. And believe me, every day those guys wake up, they live in the nostalgic standards of the past. You know, part of the way you can measure today versus yesterday is to say if your kids grew up and became the people that they worship in celebrity circles, would you be a happy person, or would you consider yourself an abject failure as a parent? I don't know. You know, when Nipsey Hussle was talking about this cure to cancer, and I can't remember what show he was on some radio show, but they also filmed it. It automatically went around the conspiracy circles. This guy has now got a target on his back, and before you know it, the guy's dead. I mean, he's dead within a year of doing that interview. And so we're all kind of going, oh, well, we know that the deep state would love the guy dead, but he's also in this gangster lifestyle because that's what his previous, I don't know anything about the guy's childhood, but it seems like he grew up in a tougher area and he stayed true to that tougher area. And so when he was shot, it was like, well, there's 100 guys that would shoot that dude. Why? Because he has what they want. It's that amazing song that Cool J made on his Bigger and Deffer album called Breakthrough. One of the lyrics was, the problem is you want what another man has, his car, his wife, or his razzmatazz, but that's weak. You got to do work on your own, because when you're rich, you got friends, but when you're poor, you're alone. That song has got more pound for pound advice for a kid in the ghetto than any song I've ever heard, ever. And it's easy to understand. It's positive. And it's got all the braggadocious stuff that they used to do back in the 80s. But part of it was you wanted to be like Cool J, depending on where you came from. Either symbolically wanted to be in command of your life and focused to get your goals, or you wanted to be exactly who that guy was. That guy has an empire now. So I guess the point I'm trying to make is that try not to dismiss the power of nostalgia, because it's now provable in a court of law that we have created a crappier version of society. There are parts of society that are fantastic and better, but we have, I think, more than 51% that's gone backwards. And we have to live in it. Our kids have to live in it. Hopefully this Gen Z, that little girl on YouTube, Soph, it's LT Corbus is her name, but her channel is SOPH. Just look that up on YouTube. She's very coarse, she's very raw, she makes me look like a saint in terms of my language. So she's definitely a rated R kind of girl, but she's been rated R since she was 11. And someone might consider that to be a failure of her parents, but in a time when we live in a world where it's like, here, 11-year-old, here, inherit this totally shitty world that we as adults have allowed to occur, because most of these people still have their head in the sand. And this little girl's like, screw you. I don't like your world. I don't like the music that sucks out there. I don't like the fact that you allow adults to marry children. I don't like pedophilia. I don't like all this stuff. I don't like the way schools are run. She's got a couple videos on how schools are managed, and she's right. You know, these kids are spending... well, she said that her school starts at 7:30 in the morning. So she goes, look, we have to get up at 6:30 in the morning to get dressed, eat, and travel to school. So she goes, there's been all these scientific studies about how younger people don't really have brain function until about 10 o'clock in the morning. And they naturally wake up later in the morning. But we just say, screw that. You don't get a chance to. It's like boot camp or something, right? Well, boot camp is for 19-year-old, 18-year-old kids. They're ready for that regiment. But a 11-year-old kid should probably be sleeping until 8 and going to bed around 11 o'clock. They've also studied that. They've studied how kids naturally get sleepy between 10 and 11. But these kids have to go to sleep at 7 or 8 if they want to have 8 hours of sleep to get up for their school cycle the next day. But they're sent home with so much homework, that's impossible. She also gave a little example I'll share with you before I close out here, because I think it's sort of indicative of, again, losing our standards in society. This kid's obviously a prodigy. And the nice thing about her is that she doesn't throw it in our face. She barely ever brags about herself, if she ever does. But she said she was listening to her teacher talk about something fairly mundane that she already understood, but the teacher had also handed out a 3-question, homework thing. So she's listening to the teacher and she's finishing the questions. It's no problem for her brain to listen to both sides. So we got a prodigy kid on our hands, but what's the teacher do? According to her, the teacher realized that she had done the questions during her dissertation or whatever it was, snatched the piece of paper out and said, you can come get this piece of paper after school's out or class is over. I think it was school's out though. And then I'm just going to delay your progress. I'm going to stunt you down to the dumbest kid in this class who needs to listen to me and not do anything else and then do their tests. So we're taking a kid that would otherwise be a prodigy and by design pulling her down. I can't speak for any other country, but the education in America is completely different in all 50 states. What they teach is different in all 50 states. As much as they have this core curriculum crap that's trying to unify that stuff, yeah, right. It doesn't work like that. Go talk to teachers. Go talk to a teacher in Massachusetts, and then talk to a teacher in the southern region of Chicago, and just see what they teach their kids. Ask them how many of the kids pass. I mean, really pass, versus getting that kind of every child left behind boot to the next grade. I started seeing this when I went to college in the early 90s. I said this once before a long time ago, but I was a pretty proficient computer programmer by 18, got a professional job doing it at 18. And then I said, I need to go back and get my degree because at some point someone's going to care, and I want to learn too. I want to learn something maybe I haven't learned. So I go to the college, and what I want to learn is C++, object-oriented C. And they said, well, you can't take this class until you take all these other classes. I was like, okay, well, I do this professionally. Nope, doesn't matter. You got to take these other classes. And so I went and spent a year and a half taking 3 classes. And then I walk into the C++ class and I sit down. And what's the teacher start teaching us? A bunch of crap that was in the other 3 classes. And so I was like, maybe this is going to get better. So I went to a couple more classes, and then I was like, this is not moving forward. We're going to spend the first half of this advanced class in the past. And so I went up to the teacher. This woman who actually ran the entire computer science department of De Anza College, I think in 1992 or so. And I said, what's the deal with teaching us all this old stuff? I was told I couldn't get in this class unless I took the prerequisites. So what are you doing teaching this old stuff? And she said, well, some of the people didn't take the prerequisites. I'm like, are you joking? I talked to the counselor. I came in as a professional credited programmer who helped invent a package that the whole world is using, or at least the whole country's using, and I got to go through these 3 classes, but the kids in here don't. It was bullshit. I never walked in that class again. I just quit. I was like, screw this, man. I'm not going to sit around doing this stuff again. I guarantee you, had computer science existed in the 60s, that wouldn't have happened. There would have been rules. You follow the rules. You get the information. Or someone could have looked at my background and said, yeah, you can go on to C++. They could have sent me with a warning. Well, you may not know everything you think you know, so you might suffer in that class if you don't know the basics. I make a decision. I go into that class and I start failing. I go, oh gosh, I got to drop out and go to those other classes. And then it's my decision. Yes. I just threw my cigar and it landed in my planter pot over there that I put all my cigar butts in. I finally did it. Should have recorded that. I hope you feel me on this one. I'd be interested in your whole take on this thing. Like, where are the standards that you remember that have been lost in society? And I think one of the most valuable opinions we could get in the comments section would be any of you in Europe. I get people knee-jerking, because they think I'm trying to say America's better than every other place in the world. It's like, well, I like where I live, but you like where you live. It's all a relative thing. But one of the biggest problems with expressing an opinion about another place is we don't know anything about those other places. You can go on a 1-month vacation and know nothing about a country. So you guys who are listening to the show from abroad, wherever you are in the world, it's not America. Please, inform us, educate me. I'll pass it on in other episodes as it comes up. So anyway, if you haven't been to deepthoughtsradio.com, please go. That's where you can change feeds from audio to video. There's a locked Facebook group with some of the coolest people on planet Earth. There's a Twitter account in case you like to get your feeds that way. There's 2 ways to donate to the show. There's Patreon for a monthly thing. Again, if you get onto Patreon, put $1 in at least, you get all these videos before everybody else gets them, minus maybe 1 or 2 a month. The Patreon account doesn't have a lot of active discussion, so just know if you do get in there, you do get a pipeline directly to me, and it's much easier for me to find Patreon comments than it is to find YouTube comments. I do my best to get in and weigh in on the YouTube comments, so please bear with me if I'm not answering or reflecting on something brilliant that you've said. And the other thing is we have a link to the new Remastered 7 Season 1. As of this recording, I have just entered the 60s. I just posted 62 today. So that'll be done probably in the next month. I'm trying to do like 4 or 5 a day, and then that'll get rid of all the backlog. BitChute is working fantastic. So again, it's not a terribly big deal at this point because YouTube is still being fairly generous with allowing our videos to be up there. Now, some channels are getting supposedly taken down. They could cite anything from your videos because they change their standards. They don't publish their rules. So this channel could literally disappear overnight. So please remember that it will be on BitChute if that ever does occur. As soon as Brighteon's 2.0 comes out, I'm going to give that another try. I will try much harder to work with their support staff, even if it doesn't work. Even if I have to say, here's a Google Drive with my videos, could you please upload them for me if that's what needs to happen? Because I think this should be out there and shouldn't be censored in any way, shape, or form. But anyway, take care of yourself and someone else, and I'll see you in the next Deep Thoughts. Over now. Motherfucker.